All right. So with Drypoint printing, what we're going to be working with predominantly is the piece of plexiglass that you all received and your etching needle that was also part of your materials that were sent home with you. What's really wonderful about this plexiglass is that you can use both sides. So while we're working with Drypoint and monotype techniques for this project, you have one side that you can reserve for dry points and then another clean side that you can reserve for monotypes, or you can work really with two dry points if you want. Each piece of plexiglass comes coated with a film. So what you want to do is when you're ready to etch, take the plastic coating off of your plate. I don't like removing the plastic ahead of time because what this plastic is doing is protecting the plate from any errant scratches. I'm also leaving the coating on the back side of this because I want to use this potentially for monotype, and I'm not doing that right now. I want to leave one side still coated so that it does have the protection of this film while I'm working. So if I've exposed one flat surface of this piece of plexiglass, and now this is ready to engrave in. There are a couple of ways to kind of prepare your plate and be ready for, prepare your image rather, to be ready to engrave into your plate. You can work directly freehand onto your piece of plexiglass. That is something you can absolutely do if you like to just kind of roll with an image and see how it forms and creates while you're engraving. You can also draw directly onto the plexiglass. What's actually kind of interesting is if you draw on the back film of this, especially if you're using text, if you draw it on the back side exactly the way that you want it to print, when you go to flip it over and engrave, it's the reverse of that image that you've drawn, and then it will print the way that you saw it when you drew it on the back side. And then when you're done with that image and you're ready to, say, print monotypes, you peel that film off, and then that drawing that you did, say in like Sharpie, comes off. You can also draw directly onto the surface of your plexiglass on the front. That's totally fine. You can wipe that Sharpie off after you've engraved, if you wish, with some alcohol or some cleaner to remove the Sharpie. Depending on the color that you mix, the Sharpie shouldn't peel off or come. I notice that sometimes if I have Sharpie on my plate and I print a light color or a yellowed color, the Sharpie tends to want to pull off the plate. So now I tend to just clean Sharpie off whenever I use it. But what the biggest thing that's really wonderful about plexiglass is that because it's see-through, you can take a sketchbook or a drawing that you've already created or another sheet of paper and actually just set your plexiglass right over the drawing and then trace out and engrave directly from a pre-existing drawing as well, which is what I'm going to do today. So I have this drawing that I did a number of years ago in a travel journal. And you're basically going to use your etching needle as if it were a pen or a pencil. It does take a little getting used to because while if I did a really light sketch right now and it would be quite faint, that would catch just a tiny bit of ink. What I want now is to not press super hard that I'm like carving or pushing all the way through, but when I push my finger over the surface of my plexiglass after I've drawn, I want to feel a little bit of texture, because what this engraving tool does is it pushes the plexiglass out of the way, so it creates a valley for your ink to hold, but also a burr that is going to show exactly what, and hold ink as well. So here, let's see if I'll grab a pencil or a Sharpie really quick. So when we were working with relief printing, this was the surface of our linoleum, and then we carved a valley so that way when we were inking and we rolled, the ink sat here and here, but didn't fill into the reservoir. Now with the plexiglass that we're working, when you're engraving, with this being the surface of your plexiglass, you aren't just creating a reservoir. What you're creating also are these burrs on the sides of the line that you're drawing. And these burrs are that plexiglass that's getting pushed out of the way. When we apply ink, the ink is going to sit here in the reservoir that you've carved, but also a little bit gets held by the burrs. And what that does is it gives your line work a little bit more of a feathered softness. But also when we're printing, and this is a bit more true when we're running it through a press, in hand printing, you're not putting as much force down as a printing press does, obviously. But sometimes these burrs can start to flatten and your line can get a little bit lighter and lighter as you print throughout, say, an edition of a Drypoint. None of you should run into that problem in this project because we're making a smaller edition, but also we're hand printing them. So these burrs should remain pretty true while we're working. So again, the ink on our reliefs sat on the surface and was away from where we've carved. But here in engraving, we want that ink to sit in the reservoir and then also get caught by those burrs. If we're carving and we don't put a lot of force down, what's going to happen is this. These burrs are going to be quite small, but also our reservoir will be rather shallow. And the problem with that is while it will hold ink, it's very easy for this ink to get wiped away when we're inking our plates. And so you want to have a distinct reservoir and have enough force when you're drawing, so that way it'll hold ink when the time comes to ink it. So let me put this over here. So when I'm engraving, let me see if I can get this a little closer. I have my plate lined up exactly where I want it, and I'm literally just going to draw over the surface of the plate. You can hear the sound of that tool kind of digging in and skipping over the surface of the plexiglass while I work. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing down enough, and then again, I'm feeling the surface of the plate. Let me see if we can get a good look at. Okay, you can kind of see, so like right here, there we go. Here you can see that the plate itself is starting to get that engraved look. What I've noticed is when I'm working, if I hold my plate up to a light or even just above me, I have the ability to see exactly what I'm already etching. The problem with this, unlike your relief prints where you could color in over the surface of what you carved and really see what you've done, the plexiglass gets a little more opaque once you've engraved into it. You can see it kind of against my apron right now where I've carved right here, or engraved rather. But it's a little bit more difficult to see what you've been working on, especially if it's up against a really light paper if you're translating it from a drawing. So always just check and kind of look at your plexiglass while you're working so that you're getting a decent idea of how your image is progressing. So I'm going to just add a few more lines into this, just so that I have an image to print for you. So what's nice about this as well is that you can take your time. and really develop some textures and line work and cross hatching so that you can have a very subtle and detailed image. It's essentially translating whatever you would have drawn into a plate so that that image then is repeatable as a multiple. Questions about the engraving process? Who has some? None? You're a quiet group today. All right, that'll be good enough for the process right now. Also, if you're working freehand, or say you get done with an image and you want to just double check in case you have anything else to add, putting it up against a darker surface gives you better insight into what you have, and you can actually see as you're carving. So if you're working freehand, I recommend having a dark surface underneath your plexiglass because you can see then the marks that you're making in real time, as opposed to being up against the light of my paper where I was almost working blind if I didn't have that drawing that was underneath. And now I'm drawing rather quickly right now because I want to have an image for you and that's a bit more refined than just a few lines, but you don't need to work quickly. This is much like with the collagraphs and the relief to an extent, is that much of your time is being spent on developing the plate, and then the inking and printing process moves rather quickly and consistently. So the time that you're spending, and also why I'm showing you this instead of monotype to start, is that the plate creation for this is again what takes time, and monotype being a little bit different. I'll show you next week, and is a bit more immediate in its creation. There we go. So that should be good for right now. So once you have your plate completely engraved, you want to then prepare your paper for the inking process. This process needs to have your paper dampened because we want the paper to be flexible enough to push into the reservoirs that you've created and catch that ink that's in there. If we use a dry piece of paper, there's just not that flexibility, and so it's just going to sit on the surface and give you a really hazy, nondescript image, whereas this dampened paper will allow you to really press the paper fibers into your print. I'm again going to print today with the 400 series, which is this thicker paper, and then another with the 300 series, which is the thinner paper, just to show you the differences between the two so that you can make a judgment on that when you're ready to print yourselves. So again, I have just a towel and a spray bottle from my studio. You can also run these under the sink and then put them in a towel while you're inking as well. But I'm just going to spray these really liberally. I want these to soak up quite a bit of water and be flexible. But similarly to your collograph printing and inking, when I did this and had the paper dampened, I want to make sure that all of this residual water, which is sitting on the paper right now, gets taken off before the printing actually happens. So while these are going to sit really damp for a little while, they're going to be dried off enough that they won't bleed the ink that I'm going to apply. So once I have those starting to soak, I'm just going to fold them into the towel and put them off to the side while I get my plate ready to ink. So the plate is a little difficult to see on the inking surface, but similarly to everything that we've been doing so far, I have the ink from the tubes that you've been supplied. You may notice sometimes your ink separates a little bit and it can get rather liquidy when you're pulling it out of the tube. If that's the case versus one that's mixed up a bit more and is a bit stiffer, you need this ink to be a bit on the stiffer side. So when it comes out of the tube and it's rather liquidy, you can add some cornstarch or some talc, something that's kind of that white light powder. Don't use baking soda, cornstarch and talcum powder. If we were in the studio, we would use magnesium carbonate. All of those will kind of soak up some of the material and that liquid that's in the ink and make it a bit more viscous, so that way it will want to stick into the crevices of your plate and hold there during the wiping process. So because this was a little bit on the soft side, I added some of that cornstarch. And just as if I were mixing colors together, I have this now in a better state, so that way it'll want to sit in my my plate better. Now, unlike the relief prints, we're not using the brayer for this inking process, because if I were to roll over this with a brayer, it won't fill in the reservoirs that I've engraved into my plate. What I want to do is push ink into the surface that I've drawn. So I have a little scraping tool. You can use a spatula. If you have a little bit of extra chipboard, you can use that as well. You just want to actually embed this ink into the lines that you've created. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to skim a little bit of the ink onto the edge of this, this tool. And then I'm going to press it down over the surface of my plate so that I'm pressing this ink into those lines. Now, I don't want to kind of load ink up and put like a huge amount on it like this, because that's just wasting the ink, because I'm going to be wiping off the surface of this plate so that just the ink sits in my lines. So if I have built up areas like that, I want to take my tool and scrape off kind of as much of the surface ink as I can, so that A, it's easier and quicker to wipe, and I'm not wasting ink in the process. So this being the first step of inking, if I were to print this right now, this is exactly what it would look like, and I wouldn't see the lines that I've actually engraved into my plate. So what I want to do now is wipe off the surface of the plate of this ink that's left over. And to do that, you can use, like I mentioned before, the cheesecloth that I have in the studio. You can use a paper towel or a rag as well. But in any sense, what you want to do, no matter what kind of slightly absorbent material you use, even an old t-shirt, if you want to cut that up, works. You want to create kind of a bald surface that has a nice flat side, because that flat side is going to start to clean the surface of the plate, but it's not going to push itself into the lines and take the ink away from the line work that you've created. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start to wipe the plate in concentric circles with this paper towel. And again, I'm not putting a lot of pressure down because I don't want to push and pull the ink out of the surface. And you can already see the difference between where I've started to wipe and where I haven't wiped. So right now I'm still cleaning off the surface of the plate while leaving everything that I've drawn. And this takes a little bit of time. the inking of a Drypoint takes longer than obviously just using a roller and rolling ink onto a relief print. I'm not pushing down hard, and I want to first get the whole plate wiped to a state where you can see I have my line work as the darkest points, but I have this very distinct haze on the plate, and that's that plate tone that I was talking about. So now you can see I've taken off a bit of ink with this paper towel, and at this point, since I've gotten a lot of it clean, I want to kind of work on a new clean section of paper towel so that I can start to clean up the areas that are hazed with that plate tone. Now here you can see even more definitively the difference between the area I haven't cleaned that has the plate tone, and then here the area that I've cleaned a second time with a cleaner piece of the towel. And so I'm just slowly working with very, very little pressure to clean off the surface of the plexiglass without taking anything out of the lines that I have engraved into my plate. Now, once I get my plate to a state that I'm happy with, I want to make sure that the edges of my plate are clean. So I'm going to take the paper towel or a rag and just really, with actually quite a bit of force, clean off the edges of my plate so that I don't get a really distinct mark along the edge. And now what you can see is I have a rather clean plate and then just the line work that I engraved into the plate. So once I get it to this point, the plate is ready to print. And so I'm going to start by making sure I have a nice clean work surface. And I'm going to take my registration sheet and lay it down. Again, I'm going to set my plate exactly where I want it. I can mark the corners as I want to print this plate over and over again and know that it's in the center. And so now here comes some differences in the printing process as well. So I'm just going to pull one of my pieces of paper out. Again, I want to make sure that the residual water that's on the surface of the plate is gone. So that way I don't bleed the work that I've done in my line work. I'll take one piece out and then leave the other in for right now. Actually missed that just a tiny bit more while I'm waiting to use it. So the piece that I'm going to be using, piece of paper that I'm using for this is the 400 series. So it's the thicker paper. And it's been soaked. So I'm going to set it down right along the registration sheet. Place it down. Now you will notice especially in the inking process, your hands will get covered in ink. So if you have gloves, use that. Also have a damp rag next to you to just wipe your hands off when you're ready to print. That way, unlike my piece of paper that has some kind of fingerprint marks on the edges, you won't have that. Now, I recommend you have for printing these is a caster wheel. So I'll send you in an email today a link to a caster wheel that I recommend. And why I recommend having a caster wheel is that it pushes down enough pressure onto the plate to really press the paper in. Sometimes with a spoon or a Baron, you just don't get as much force as you can get with the caster wheel. I will print the other one that's on the lighter paper using a spoon so you can see the difference between the two. So once I've laid down my protective sheet, I'm going to take this caster wheel and literally press and roll it over the surface of my plate from top to bottom. And I'm working first in one direction and overlapping where I've rolled before. You can see how this top sheet really starts to move around. And then I'm going to work in the other direction along the whole surface of my plate. And then I want to work diagonally. You want to make sure, much like cross-hatching, that you get the whole surface of your drawn image onto the paper. And so you don't want to miss any distinct area. And one last, working kind of all four directions. And now when I lift this up, I just want to make sure that I can see a rather nice kind of plate indentation. It's a little hard to see right now, but I will post a picture. And so once I have what I feel is a completely impressed plate, I want to just lift and take a look, and then that looks actually pretty darn good. And so here then you can see the translation of my plate, which now has very little, if any, ink in its surface, and all of that has kind of translated onto this print. You can see too that there's still some residual plate tone. So when you're inking your plate, especially even if you have an area that doesn't have any image on it, make sure you kind of scrape ink over all that surface, because that way you have a consistent plate tone. I'll take a picture of this and post it onto Blackboard, but you'll be able to see that there are some spots that I didn't ink at all that is pure white versus the kind of really light gray plate tone, which you may get rather consistently, and that's okay. I have very distinct differences between the lines that I've engraved and then my background. Here you can also see, particularly in this area where it's a bit more dense with my line work, that kind of softer, kind of feathery look. And that's because those burrs are a bit more concentrated in that area. I'm going to ink this plate up again and print it with a spoon so that you can see the difference between using the caster and using a spoon. And you're welcome to experiment with other ways of printing this, but you do need a lot of like specific force down on your plate in order to get the ink out of these lines. Let me just do this quickly. Again, I'm pushing the ink down into the line work. And then I'm going to take my paper towel. You can reuse your kind of inking paper towels. Your first wipes of your plate are usually rather filled with ink, so you can reuse this because you won't be taking a lot of ink off from your lines when you're doing this first inking and wiping. So again, I've used kind of the dirtier part of my paper towel to wipe off this first round of ink to really kind of start to see my lines that I've engraved. And now I want to I'm just going to take a new piece and then get a nice clean surface to then, without very little pressure, start to just clear out the plate tone and make my lines visible. I'm not putting a lot of pressure down because I don't want to push my paper towel into the lines that I engraved and lose that. So that looks good. I'm going to just clean off my work area really quickly because I did make a mess there. The beauty of working with these water-soluble inks is that your cleanup is rather quick. So here I have then this plate again. And I'm going to take the 300 series paper, which is the thinner paper. Press out any of that surface water so that it doesn't bleed my line work. Set it across the surface. Take my piece of parchment paper, and then for this one I'm going to use a spoon. I don't want to use something like a Baron because it just spreads out the force a bit too much, and so you don't get that kind of ability to push the fibers of the paper down into the line work. So I'm going to use a wooden spoon. You can use a metal spoon and just really work much like using the caster wheel. Work in one direction first. Pushing actually down quite hard. And then once you get all the way in one direction, switch directions. And then here with the spoon, you have a better idea of just where it is because you're actually feeling it and actually pushing directly with your fingers. I'm going to go crossways. And just for safe measure, do the other crossways. There we go. And now I'm going to just peek. Oh, that worked. Excellent. So here again, you can see then the use of the thinner paper with the spoon actually created a print that is equal, I would say, to the thicker paper with the caster. I will today print another without the caster, but on this thick paper with a spoon, so you can really start to see the differences between the papers and then the printing mechanisms, so that you can make your best decisions as to what you want to use. But I have a feeling that using a spoon should be more than fine, especially if you're using the thinner paper. So here we have two prints. I would consider these an addition. They'd have to be a variable addition because they're on two different papers. But we're going to be working both with Drypoint techniques as well as monotype techniques for this next set of prints. So not only will you have the image that you're creating with your Drypoint, but then you'll have the ability to add imagery with the use of monotype techniques as well, which I'll show you next week. But I wanted to show you this week, especially for those of you that are finishing up your collagraphs now. You can start to really develop your plates, which is what's going to take the most time with this project. Again, with cleanup, it's very simple. You just want to take a light wipe with a rag. unlike your collagraphs, this being plastic, it's not going to warp or anything with water. So you could even run this in under the sink and dry off. And you should still always feel a little bit of roughness on the surface of your plate. If in the printing process you notice that your image is getting a little lighter and you don't feel the same roughness from those burrs, you can always go back in and re-engrave some lines and kind of build that burr back up. So simply because some of your lines maybe were softer and are fading doesn't mean you can't re-up them and get them back into your prints. What questions are there about Drypoint, whether it be the engraving process or the inking process that you all have right now? All right, I'm going to stop the recording